planted first the crown and then the man in the crowd as trial balloons, or whether the two tribunes, hoping to score political points, engineered both events, or whether one was engineered by one side and the other by the other, or whether they were both just signs of organic public support for a King Caesar. Whoever had done what, though, talk of monarchy was in the air. For many who would take part in the assassination plot, though, the last straw was when a group of senators came to bestow upon Caesar a long list of new honors, father of the fatherland, imperator, that sort of thing, and Caesar had failed to rise to greet them. There are conflicting reports about whether Caesar was sick at the time and the whole incident was blown out of proportion by his enemies, or whether he simply miscalculated the depths of the Senate's new subservience. But regardless, the story got out and the rumor mill was fed. Caesar downplayed all this kingly talk, but continued to consolidate power at the same time. He stepped down from the consulship in October and placed two loyal politicians in the office, bypassing both the Senate and public elections. But his successors were just placeholders. Next, he had the Senate formally appoint him dictator, but unlike his previous flirtations with the office, this time he would not be stepping down anytime soon. He was granted a sequence of 10 consecutive one-year terms as dictator. But even this proved not to be enough, and in early 44 BC, he cast aside the expiration date and had himself named dictator in perpetuity, dictator for life. He may not be a king, but it was in name only. And even the in name only part seemed destined to be cast aside, as Caesar had a priest announce a contrived prophecy that only a king could conquer the Parthian Empire. And everyone knew that Caesar was planning, with the full support of the Roman people, to launch a war with Parthia to revenge the losses of Crassus. So if they wanted the mission to succeed, well, you heard the prophecy. But the movement to make Caesar a king seems to have died in February of 44 BC, during a rather strange, it was even considered strange by Roman standards, religious festival that involved men running through the streets naked. Mark Antony produced a laurel crown, announcing that the people had asked him to offer it to Caesar. But the reception from those same people seemed to indicate that they felt exactly the opposite. Roman crowds cheered when they approved of something and were silent when they did not. When Antony offered the crown, you could have heard a pin drop. Caesar immediately read the crowd's reaction and used the opportunity not to crown himself monarch as he may have planned, but to declare forcefully that Jupiter alone was the king of Rome. At this, the crowd exploded in cheers. They may accept autocracy, but they would never accept monarchy. Whether or not it was Caesar's plan all along to win support of the masses by engineering a very public rebuke of monarchy, it was clear that it was a good thing for Caesar that the prophecy was a complete fabrication. The last months of Caesar's life were consumed with this planned invasion of Parthia. He had already moved 16 legions and 10,000 cavalry across the Adriatic, and was preparing to launch his campaign in April of 44 BC. What Caesar had in mind seemed crazy for a man nearing the age of retirement, but his self-confidence was unwavering, and he dreamed of nothing less than the greatest series of conquests in Roman history, conquests to rival Alexander himself. Caesar planned to invade Parthia via Armenia, and after defeating the Parthians, which he took to be a foregone conclusion based off of what he had seen of their armies while passing through the east, he would march north through the Caucasus, pacifying the fierce nomadic tribes of the steppes, and then follow the Danube River back into Europe, capping off his run by conquering Germania. His plan, in short, was to return to Italy the greatest Roman who had ever lived. If only he had lived. Caesar's enemies realized that time was running out for them to do something. It could be years before he was back in Rome, and if he managed to accomplish half of what he was setting out to do, there would be no stopping him upon his return. The people would beg Caesar to be their king. The Republic would be destroyed forever. The time to act was now. In the months since Caesar's victory in Spain, the list of conspirators had grown to some 60 names. Some, like Cassius, were on board because they had been Caesar's enemies from the start. Others, like Gaius Trebianus, had been with Caesar from the time of the Gallic Wars, but felt sidelined in his new regime. In his zeal to embrace his enemies, Caesar had pushed aside the friends who had got him to where he was. To men like Trebianus, Caesar was no longer a vehicle for their own personal ambition, but rather an obstacle in its path. Finally, there were men like Marcus Brutus, the tortured Judas of the Ides of March, who seems to have simply been a Republican idealist pushed into the plot by domineering friends. They reminded him constantly of his ancestor Marcus Junius Brutus, who had led the revolution against the Tarquins and sworn the Romans to their sacred oath of opposing monarchy forever. Every night, on a statue of that Brutus, graffiti would appear, asking if the Brutus name was dead. Though he loved Caesar personally, Brutus finally caved to the pressure and agreed to join the plot and exploit the fact that he was the last person Caesar would suspect of treachery. For the most part, the collection of plotters were personal rivals who, on any normal day, would have had nothing to do with each other. But this was no ordinary day. Today, they all agreed that Caesar must be killed. Numerous assassination scenarios were hashed out, but the conspirators finally settled on a meeting of the Senate as the right time and place. Only senators would be allowed into Pompey's theater, which is where the body had temporarily moved to, leaving Caesar without the protection of his bodyguards. Formal senatorial togas would also allow the assassins to easily conceal their daggers, the agreed-upon murder weapon. The plan was simple: lure Caesar into the Senate, surround him, and then stab him to death. With Caesar planning to leave Rome in just a few days, the conspirators also set a date, the 15th of March. Being the midpoint of the month, the 15th was also known by the name we are all familiar with today, the Ides of March. Caesar awoke on the morning of the 15th and tried to go about his business as usual. There were final preparations to sort out before he left for the east, and the Senate had been called into the session that day so that he could review some new petition. Caesar had been warned previously by a soothsayer to be on guard on the Ides of March, and he was further troubled by the fevered nightmares of his wife Calpurnia, who had dreamed just that night of his death. His wife and friends begged him to listen to the ill omens that surrounded the day and stay home. And while Caesar considered the option, he was convinced by his old surrogate son Brutus that to ignore the Senate's request for his presence would be seen as a great insult. They were already assembled and awaiting his appearance. To simply blow them off would be the height of bad manners, and feed royal rumors. Caesar was convinced. He would go and humor the old men one last time before leaving for the simple comforts of his military tent. The worst he was likely to suffer listening to whatever overwrought petition the Senate had deemed worthy of his attention was acute boredom. The petition, of course, was a fake, entered for public consideration by the plotting senators to lure their prey into a trap. Caesar made his way through the streets, carefully led by Brutus. Mark Antony had learned the night before that some plot was afoot, though he did not know the details of the plan, and hurried to try and warn Caesar. But Brutus carefully steered the dictator in through a back door. Antony was unable to reach him through the crowd. Caesar took his place at the front of the chamber and requested the petition. The senator who brought the scroll forward handed it over, but as he did so, he grabbed at Caesar's toga. Caesar was shocked by the move and exclaimed, "Why, this is violence." With Caesar held in place, another senator named Servilius Casca approached from behind and, pulling a dagger from his robes, stabbed at Caesar's throat. Military instinct taking over, Caesar dodged the attack and seized Casca's arm, crying, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" Casca, having lost the element of surprise, called out for his brothers to help him. At this word, the 60 members of the conspiracy rushed in and surrounded Caesar, stabbing at him recklessly. Caesar tried to run, but blinded by blood and confusion, tripped and fell. As he lay on the ground, the stabbing continued. In the end, all Caesar could do was cover his face with his toga and die in a pool of his own blood. The legend surrounding the assassination has Caesar in anguish seeing Brutus among his attackers and crying either, "You too, child?" or, in Shakespeare's poetic turn, "Et tu, Brute?" But these last words did not begin to appear in the historical record until much later, and even then, as in the case of Suetonius, the quotes are simply noted but dismissed as inaccurate. A similar embellishment has Brutus crying, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, over Caesar's dead body. Dramatic and memorable, yes, but a complete fiction. Instead, the assassins are reported to have simply marched out of the chamber, leaving Caesar's body behind. They are said to have then paraded through the streets, announcing that they had killed Caesar and set Rome free. But to their surprise, they were not met as the liberators they imagined themselves to be. The people of Rome greeted them instead with stunned silence. Then they went home. Then they locked their doors. It was about to be blown apart. Julius Caesar died on the 15th of March, 44 BC. He had been stabbed 23 times, though doctors determined that in the end, only a single thrust to his heart had been fatal. He was the last and greatest of the old triumvirs, but in the end, just like Crassus and Pompey before him, he died a violent death, a victim of his own outsized ambition. For a brief moment, the fate of Rome hung in the balance. Would the liberators, as they were now calling themselves, see their dream of a restored republic come true, or would Julius Caesar be revealed as merely a symptom of the disease that plagued Rome, rather than the cause? Next week, the full extent of the rot at the core of the Republican system will be revealed. Mark Antony will turn the people against the supposed liberators, reminding the masses that all Caesar had ever done was remove the unjust chains placed upon them by greedy oligarchs. Brutus and Cassius, who fancied themselves heroes, will be driven from the city they thought they had saved, and Caesar's revealed heir, Gaius Octavius, the bright young great-nephew of the dead dictator, will make his first appearance on the public stage. The Romans will be forced to endure another 13 years of chaos and civil war before they are once again granted peace. After all the violence, it will not matter to anyone that the peace will be guaranteed by the rule of a single man, Gaius Octavius, Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 47, Octavius Octavian. Julius Caesar was dead. Upon hearing the news, the people of Rome shut themselves up in their homes. After years of civil war, peace had finally come to the turbulent capital, but now Caesar's final settlement turned out to be little more than the eye of the hurricane. The people implicitly understood that the liberators' vision of a restored republic would mean little more than the return of violent chaos. So they did not rush to embrace Cassius. They did not cheer for Brutus. They simply turned their backs, resigning themselves to what was clearly this generation's lot in life: pain, sacrifice, and bloodshed. And not only did the people of Rome get it exactly right, that Caesar's murder would lead to renewed civil strife, but the liberators got it exactly wrong. Far from restoring the old republican order, the assassination of Julius Caesar hastened its demise. The liberators made three basic intertwined mistakes. First and foremost, they had no plan for what to do after Caesar was dead. In a classic display of not thinking through the consequences of one's actions, they were so obsessed with removing the dictator that they did not think about who would fill the power vacuum when he was gone. It seems not to have occurred to them to make arrangements for someone, anyone, to assume executive power once the man who had consolidated nearly all executive power into his hands was gone. It was a palace coup without a replacement king waiting in the wings. And this exposed their second great mistake, focusing all their attention on Caesar. In the moments after the assassination, Mark Antony fled from Pompey's theater, disguised himself as a slave, and fled the city, convinced that he would be a target of assassination himself. When you depose a ruler, it's just common sense to purge his supporters at the same time. Otherwise, they come back and undo everything you were trying to accomplish by deposing the ruler in the first place. Which is, of course, exactly what Antony did a few days later when he realized no one was out to get him. As consul for that year, an unharmed Mark Antony had every legitimate reason to step